today to offer some thoughts from the orthopedic industry. As mentioned, I'm in research at Zimmer Biomet, which is an orthopedics device company. I'm also currently chair of the ASME VNV40 subcommittee. And so there'll be some aspects of the personality and the opinions of that committee that are also coming out in this talk. So as mentioned, just to level set everyone, I come from the orthopedics device industry. Like many others in the device industry, the mission of my company and the mission of me within the company is to improve the quality of life for patients through musculoskeletal solutions. Traditionally, this is devices, but as more time goes on, it's more than devices. It's rehab, it's planning, it's delivery, it's all the other things that are associated with musculoskeletal care. And as part of doing this, naturally, we need to make sure that the products, the solutions are of high quality, the best quality, and do not pose any risk to the patients. And of course, we're also in a highly regulated industry all around the world. Now, within this space, though, we have tremendous opportunities within Silico methods to advance these sorts of things, to both improve the quality of what we're doing because of the insights that we can get into device performance that can only be obtained through in silico methods, and also to compete commercially, because in silico methods do provide the chance to do things more quickly, more economically than other sorts of methods. So in the short time we have today, I want to talk about a couple emerging applications. And I frame this around the idea of a low bar and a high bar. Having a daughter who's in gymnastics right now, I'm very comfortable with these bars. And so I'm going to talk about two of these. Low bar sort of speaks to a lot of the things that are done day to day within the orthopedics device industry, which is supporting benchtop testing. The higher bar really speaks to some of the emerging applications that we see as the technologies within silico methods continue to advance. And that is really getting more towards directly supporting clinical decision making, directly supporting claims on clinical performance and things of that sort. So first off, for the low bar, much of what we do in the device industry is finally associated with worst case identification. So here's an example of a shoulder stem. We have a benchtop test that we use to finally confirm that the stem performs sufficiently well, and in this case, it's a strength evaluation. And we use in silico methods to support that benchtop testing. There are various ways we can do that. We can do worst case analysis. We can look at loading conditions. We can look at combinations, all these sorts of things to manage down the amount of physical testing that we need to do. Many of these are also associated with standardized methods. It's a little bit potentially different than the standards that were mentioned in earlier talks today. Really prescriptive, very specific computational methods that if you want to analyze a system in this way, these are the steps you need to follow. We have a variety of methods like that within the orthopedics device industry, which we are obligated to follow. As an example of why we need to do this, contemporary orthopedic systems have many, many variations. And so this is one exemplar, not unique really in any way. It's a shoulder system. And within the shoulder system, you will see that there are several different stems that are available to be used in the patient, depending on the preferences of the surgeon. And once the stem is put in, there are all sorts of combinations that can be used to start to resolve the articulation. You can either have an anatomical reconstruction. You have a couple different options with anatomical reconstructions. You can also have reverse reconstructions. With all these sorts of things, you can imagine all the different combinations. We need to evaluate the safety of all of these. Doing all these sorts of things within a benchtop test is really not feasible. This is the application of modeling in many of the use cases that we encounter today. So now the opportunity here in this low bar is how can we make this most efficient? How can we optimize the automation to evaluate all these different systems by pulling in all the different widgets, all the different combinations, all the different loading conditions, do it as efficiently as possible. Efficiency is great as long as we also have accuracy. How do we ensure the credibility of these sorts of models so that we have confidence that the predictions are correct? And once we do those sorts of things, how can we standardize the methods to set the low bar so that all players in this space really do need to demonstrate, need to follow these methods to use in silico methods, but to also use them accurately and well. So those are some of the opportunities in this low bar. Now I want to talk to some of the more interesting applications, I think, which is really support for the clinic. And so this is a very nice slide that a colleague from the FDA put together a couple years ago that highlights a range of different ways that we use modeling within medical devices these days. For this higher bar, I want to focus on a couple particular applications, simulation as a device and simulating treatment outcomes. And really the goal is simulating treatment outcomes. So not just device safety, but when we put this particular device in this particular patient in this particular way, can we actually predict what the outcome is going to be? So to talk about this, I want to take a brief side trail and talk about the regulatory pathway, because this now is where we can use in silico methods to good end. There are a couple pathways that I'm laying out here, one that's appropriate for the EU today and one that's appropriate within the United States. A very typical EU pathway is to do preclinical testing, and once that testing is done, we do a product launch. But once that product is launched, we are obligated to do a clinical follow-up of tracking patients, which seems like a sensible thing to do. And if that follow-up continues well, then 5 years we can come up for renewal. In the US, it's a little bit different. For certain types of devices, some of the more novel devices, we have to do that clinical study prior to launch. And so now you see the criticality of that clinical study. If it's long, you're preventing product launch. You're preventing patient access to devices. You're preventing sales of the devices. So it's really, really important to do whatever we can to make sure the clinical study is appropriate, but also as it's contained, as is appropriate for the device. So this then leads to in silico clinical trials. So the current challenges with these clinical studies are we have a wide range of patient characteristics that these devices are intended to take care of. Many, many cases. And it may be difficult to find some of these patients. So we have rare demographics, we have rare pathologies, we have rare surgical procedures, but we are obligated to try and get all those sorts of data for all those different types of patients. And in practice, we can't. It's very hard to get those within a reasonably contained clinical study. So we may miss on some of those patient cohorts. Further, we may have drop rates during the course of a clinical study. Patients that were initially enrolled, we lose track of them over time. Further, we may require different clinical studies for different variants of the same implant. And so what that means is this intended clinical study, which is intended to examine all the different combinations out there, really ends up being quite constrained in its scope. Here's another example. So within a hip stem, similar to the shoulder system I showed earlier, we will have several different systems. And within these systems, we will need clinical data for each of those systems. So maybe for a clinical study, we say, finally, we want to make sure we have 50 patients that we are tracking for this system. Well, to take care of potential fallout over time, to make sure we get the rare accommodations, we may need to enroll several hundred patients to get to that final 50 count at the end of the study. Further, we may have different variants of the system. So a collared system, not just a collarless system. So now we need to double that. And so now we have 400 patients that we need to track with the hope of retaining 100 patients at the end of the study. And even with this, we still may not have sufficient data for some of these extreme conditions. And if we don't have the sufficient data, well, in the EU, we may need to pull some of those variants from the market. In the US, it may delay commercial release. So these are serious implications. So what can we do now? Well, let's use in silico methods to do this, to augment the clinical trials, to address the challenges, to fill gaps, and to satisfy the regulatory requirements. And so what we're doing here is basically taking those folks, those patients that we can't track within a clinical study, and we are essentially digitizing them. We are coming up with an in silico model for those patients to represent those conditions with the hope that the level of evidence coming from the in silico methods are commensurate with what would come from actually tracking these patients clinically. How to do this? Well, there are many, many things that we would like to simulate. There are many, many things that we are interested in study as part of the clinical performance of devices. Here is a laundry list that is true for many, many systems in the orthopedic space. We should not try and evaluate all of these sorts of things. So we need to carefully scrutinize which things we want to chase after. Patient risk. What are the ones that are most risky to the patient for the particular device that we're looking at? What is the design impact? There are some types of patient risks that are in fact not impacted by the design. We need not incorporate those within an in silico trial. And finally, model viability. If we're honest with ourselves, as much as we are trying to advocate for in silico methods, there is not everything we can simulate to the level that we need to. So we need to make sure that the state of the art and the modeling technologies is sufficiently mature before we start to bring these into an in silico clinical trial. And once this is done, then we can start to come up with numerical surrogates for the clinical outcomes that we're trying to replace. Now, in all this, I want to touch briefly on a topic that Lise briefly mentioned at the end, which is credibility. It's great to do these sorts of things, and in many cases, we can do these sorts of things, but we need to make sure that they're credible. This is a question that we need to contemplate, and this is where standards organizations like ASME or guidances like VNV40 can come into play. But they're not quite where they need to be yet, because so much of the focus of developing the credibility of in silico methods is really focused on the paradigm of let's use benchtop testing to do it. And we see this, in fact, within the structure of ASME VNV40, where we laid out ideas of a computational model and a comparator and assessment. What are the test samples, test conditions, all the typical things we may evaluate within a benchtop study. But for clinical data, these things are not directly relevant because they're different things that we can control in a clinical study. They're different things we can't control in a clinical study. There are some outcomes we can get in a clinical study to validate or calibrate our model, which are fundamentally different than the same sorts of things we can get from a benchtop study. So there's a lot of interest nowadays to probe these sorts of things. I want to call out a couple here in the interest of time. One is there's a working group specifically within VVUQ40, which is focused on using real-world data for model credibility, trying to tease out what are the differences between model validation versus model calibration. What are the relative strengths and weaknesses of using real-world data versus benchtop data? And how can we combine both of these data sources, both the processes of validation and calibration, to overall come up with the level of credibility of the model that we need? Another working group that is focused on this is working group 3, which is patient-specific modeling, very similar to what Lisa was speaking about with some of her technical work in the previous talk. When these sorts of things happen, when we're doing patient-specific modeling, increasingly we are doing tiered validations, right? We are starting from basic mechanical tests, more complicated mechanical tests, maybe going to animal studies, maybe going to in vivo studies, layer upon layer of either calibration or validation activities. How can we bring together all these sorts of different activities to finally address the one question that has to be answered for a model, which is the model credible enough for the context of use? So a couple summary points, and then I will stop. So first, I hope that you will believe, you will join me in believing there are opportunities for innovation in silico methods, both for traditional and emerging applications. We have a great opportunity to use modeling to augment clinical trials. If we do this, there can be a profound impact in the device space. However, work towards these sorts of applications, work towards ISDT, will require evolution of credibility strategies, both in theory and in practice. So with that, I would like to thank some colleagues here at Zimmer Biomet who have assisted with this, and also the VVUQ40 community, and happy to take any questions as time allows. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff Bischoff. Yes, indeed, there are questions, and we have almost no time left, but one with a brief answer, please. Jeff, are you afraid of once successfully done in silico trials, regulators making in silico an additional hurdle in clinical trials?
No, I'm not afraid of that. In fact, I think there is sufficient hesitancy that it's going to take more than one success story to make this commonplace. In fact, I would say we really need a couple of wonderful success stories to really build the regulatory momentum in the community to keep on going. So not fearful at all.